Hi, my name is Sam from Carve's Performance Garage. On this week's episode of Shed Sesh, we finish installing some brake lines, replace some old fuel lines, finish some more interior wiring, fix the dash and its wiring, install new front sway bar Endlinks, and install the engine. So because I resprayed the engine bay, I needed to remove all the brake lines to ensure that I could get good paint coverage over the whole bay. Another thing that happened was as I was removing the brake lines off the NA shell, the flare nuts I rounded quite a bit. The WRX's flare nuts were in much better condition, so I decided to swap the brake lines over. With the brake lines out of the WRX, it was time to put them into the new shell. All this footage was recorded before my last Shed Sesh video, so that's why you can see some things in the engine bay haven't been done yet. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of putting the brake booster and the clutch master cylinder in first. Because of that, I then had to remove the brake booster and also remove the bolts that connect the clutch reservoir to the master cylinder. It is very important when working with any brake lines you use a flare nut spanner. Due to another project, I actually bought these new EP2 flare nut spanners. They're flexible at the head, and it was a lot easier to ensure that the flare nuts were done up tight because I could flex the spanner into the best position possible. Once everything was all tight and connected, I could then reinstall the brake booster along with the clutch fluid reservoir. I decided to replace the old fuel lines to connect the hard lines to the actual fuel rails. The fuel line used is some -6 fuel line, and then the breather hose is the -4 line. As I wasn't reusing the old lines, I just cut them off so it was easier to remove, and then I just got the old line and measured it up with just some new line. I attached all the power steering lines together and installed the condenser. I replaced all of the O-rings just to ensure that I'll have no leaks when I decide to gas the system. I decided to do this early because with the heater core in, there was AC gas liquid that was dripping onto my brand new white engine bay. I'm not sure if it stains, but I installed it so it meant that there would be no more leaking onto my fresh paint. As both cars share the same air conditioning parts, I decided to just reuse a mixture of the both depending on the condition of the parts. There's a good mixture of everything and it's all compatible, so it didn't really matter. The most time-consuming part of doing a full body swap is the wiring. With so many different connectors and different wires, it was critical that I kept track and I labelled everything. When I took all of the wiring out of the WRX, I ensured that I took a lot of photos and labelled every single connector to where they go. For reinstallation, this proved critical as it meant that I could easily find where everything goes. I'm so glad that I took the time early to do all of this, as if I didn't, it would have been a lot of Googling different photos from interiors and probably just ripping apart my girlfriend's WRX to try figure out where all the wiring goes. So my process was, when I took apart a connector, I labelled both the connector and the wiring associated to it. As when laying out the wiring in the car, it's easiest to just try lay out everything in its relative spot. On most of the connectors, I labelled them with a little code. I used the code PASS or DRIV. This stood for passenger side or driver's side. This meant that I could easily determine what side of the wiring the car goes, and basically as all the wiring kind of flows together, it was easy to route everything into the right place. Plus, for any connectors that I did not label, Because the wiring was labelled passenger or driver, theoretically that connector would be on that side of the car, and hopefully the wiring would go to that approximate location so I could easily troubleshoot things. Along with coding and labelling, I actually used different colour tapes to code and label different things. So I used blue tape to basically wrap around any sort of bolts or hardware that's associated with that wiring. I used white tape with a connector that's being used, and then I used red tape with any connectors that were unplugged. These color codes actually proved really helpful, especially for the connectors that weren't plugged in. As these wiring looms often are adapted into different models across different parts of the world, it could prove troublesome if I was to plug something in that wasn't meant to be plugged in. Or if I just had a random connector, I would be stumped and needing to research where that connector actually goes to only find out that I could just leave it there. Some of the obvious connectors, like the connectors that go to the steering wheel and the connectors to the cluster, I didn't label as they were very obvious to me personally, but if you're doing it yourself and you're quite new, I would absolutely label everything. One thing that I will definitely be doing in the future is doing a better job at taking photos. I took a lot of photos across the wiring, but unfortunately when it came to reinstallation, a lot of those photos actually did not prove useful at all. They were either blurry or just didn't include all the wiring routing. Most of my photos were targeted towards individual connectors, but they didn't show the bigger picture. So yes, I knew where it plugged into, but I didn't know the exact wiring route that the wires would go through to then plug into that connector. Without the proper routing, it could mean that a connector would not reach the other connector, or a part may not fit properly. This clip is a clear example of why I needed to take more in detail pictures, because when I was connecting the ECU, I couldn't figure out the proper cable routing. This meant that I had to take the shroud on and off a few times, but eventually, with enough persistence and some more research, I got it all together fine. Because I'm using the WRX ECU, it would mean that I would need to use the WRX key. So to take the ignition barrel off and the steering wheel lock, I needed to use a punch and a hammer to remove the bolts. The bolts are shear bolts, as in hope that it's not easy for someone to actually change this, but once you actually do get a little bit of purchase on the bolts and you tap them a few times, they loosen up pretty easily. They are a little bit tricky to turn around, but eventually, with enough persistence, I got them out. I also marked the location of the key barrel as it coincides with a bit of interior. If I didn't do this, it would mean I would have to constantly be taking on and off this little bit of interior to then get the alignment perfect. Along with the alignment of the interior pieces, it also aligns with the steering wheel lock. So if that's not aligned properly, the steering wheel won't lock. When I took the dash off originally, I was actually really dumb and didn't realize that there's actually two bigger connectors that I could disconnect that would disconnect all of the wiring associated with the dash. I absolutely destroyed one of the dashes trying to get it out because I was not careful and I didn't spot this early. So I had to carefully remove all of the ducting associated with the heating and the cooling to then route the wiring properly. There's a few screws that hold this wiring in, so I needed to remove a bit so I could actually screw it all in. This is a mistake I definitely will not be making again. I decided to upgrade the front sway bar Endlinks because the old Endlinks were A, worn out, but B, they were also an older design. By older design of adjustable Endlink, I'm talking about these Endlinks probably would have come out around about 2008, 2009, around that era, so many improvements have been done to the actual design. The aftermarket Endlinks that also came with the car were not adjusted correctly. So luckily I still had a set of OEM Endlinks from the WRX that was on the old sway bars that I could quickly get measurements off and measure accordingly to ensure that the sway bar Endlink length
was perfect. When putting any adjustable suspension in, you always want to start with the length of the stock before you actually start adjusting it. With the engine bay ready to go, I decided to put the engine in. With barely anything in the engine bay, it was really easy to just put the engine in, but the solid engine mounts don't have little locating notches. I was quite afraid that I wouldn't get it centered, but I found out that I could just recenter it later on. Once the engine was in place, I got underneath the car and put the nuts to hold the engine to the subframe. While we were releasing the tension of the engine crane, I noticed that the engine was tilting forward quite a lot. Unfortunately, because I don't have the transmission in, I couldn't put the pitch stop mount on, so I bolted a D-shackle to the engine bay and just used these little small ratchet strap things to connect it to the pitch stop mount. This held the engine in nice and stable, so it meant that I would not be afraid of it tipping. With the way the subframe is designed, the engine is always going to tip forward. There's no risk of it tipping back unless I basically push it back. So with the engine in place, I could take off the straps that hold it to the engine crane. The engine was in and we were done. When taking engines in and out, you can do it yourself pretty easily, but just having that second person is extremely helpful. Where one person can ensure that the engine is going in the right spot and also give guidance to the second person who's operating the engine crane to lower it and raise it as needed. So I was pretty lucky to have my mate Lawrence on hand, so I put him to work and he helped me install the engine. And that's it for Shed Sesh Episode 2. If you like this video, please comment below. If you have any feedback suggestions, also chuck them in the comments. And if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up button below. And if you want to see more of my content, please subscribe. Thanks for watching and have a great day.